Okay, well, we'll get started. Hi, everybody. I am Alison Daley. I am the founder and CEO of a company called Recruiting Innovation. We have an online technical training platform for today's modern recruiter. And I'm so excited today for this conversation with Anthony Lewis. Anthony is with Beacon Talent, and he'll do his intro here in a minute. But I am just so excited to have this conversation with you, Anthony, and with our audience, and for people that are going to tune in later, because this is such a timely topic. And for all you that are joining us, this conversation is on pathways to diversity, equity, and inclusion, new models for the recruiting paradigm, with Alison Daley and Anthony Lewis. So Anthony, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about you?
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate it, Allison. And so, I am with Beacon Talent. We're a consultancy, very much, if you think about a McKinsey or a Booz Hamilton, we provide growth stage organizations with not only pipelines to talent across a myriad of different functions, whether it's customer success, tech, even at the C level, but also frameworks, including when you think about DE&I, but also including, how do you think about talent in general? How do you think about employee experience, onboarding, recruiting, and how do you think about a much more holistic recruiting process? Our belief is that, recruiting isn't just kind of I hold the keys kind of game anymore. It's definitely about process and engagement. And with Beacon, our focus is providing these growth stage organizations who may not have an internal recruiting team or talent team, and don't have the resources compared to the FANG companies, right? Facebook, Apple, etc., but do need them to compete. And so we are helping them level the playing field, and we're democratizing hiring with some of the frameworks that we help kind of provide these growth state organizations. So excited to speak specifically today with Alison, and because this is a very, very pertinent topic that is close to home for me, and I think is still, still highly relevant, even as popular it is today. So.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, how I like that you all are focused on the structure and the system of hiring, because when we do not have a framework to follow, that means every recruiter, every hiring manager is sort of doing their own thing, and that's not scalable, that's redundant, and it causes an element of, like drag, basically. And then when you are trying to do not only scale, but then scale in a way that's going to bring about a demographic mix of your team that isn't just inherently going to happen, you have to have intention baked in. And so as part of that, I'm really curious to hear more from you. Let's just start with like, what does diversity, equity, inclusion mean for you and your organization? Like, let's get some operational, like confirmed terms here. Definitions.
No, that's a great question. There's a lot of studies out there of what DE&I is. The acronyms themselves: diversity, equity, inclusion. I often speak and think about D&I in terms of operational principles, right? Like they have functional definitions, right? Diversity, I often say is, individuals aren't diverse, right? Communities and teams are, right? That is my definition. Equity is about not necessarily, what is fair, but what is equitable, right? I think equitable is different from fair. For example, very small example, you have a team and you're ordering like t-shirts for a trip or outing with your organization, and you do a blanket buy of all large sizes for your team. Maybe that's fair, but I don't think that's equitable, because people come in different shapes and sizes, and equity is about surveying your team and getting unique sizing for each person, right? Like that is it, what is equitable. And then when you think about like inclusion is about psychological safety. It's about creating an environment where people feel safe, feel valued. So you can have a diverse work environment, right, made up of different kinds of peoples and background, but it may not necessarily be equitable or inclusive, right? So these things are I treat them as operating principles, and it's really important to understand that they can live independently of each other. But the reason why we treat them in put them in a trifecta is because they together they create a much more productive organization. That your organization needs to be all three. It needs to be diverse, it needs to be equitable, and it needs to be inclusive. And you need to measure and consider all three of those things separately, but together as well.
Sorry, I'm muting. I've got a toddler in the background in between. So we all know how those are rolling today.
Yeah.
I'm also curious. So it's interesting the thought about the equitable in terms of the shirt sizes. I think that's something that we can all relate to. What have you seen in terms of these terms and like what it's not? Because I think sometimes it also helps to pull out, we hear these words applied this way, but that's actually not what it means.
Right, right. That's a really great question, and I think this question is extremely important because we're in a landscape where everyone is trying to do, right? Everyone's trying to understand what diversity is, and I think by looking at it, and from that lens, it's very easy to miss, to your point, Allison, what it is and not, right? There's a very thin line between that. And so I'll tell you what it's not through examples, right? I don't think, for example, diversity is targeting people by ethno and demographic traits, right? I don't think diversity is going on LinkedIn and lining up all the people you believe look like women or Black or brown or Latinx folks, targeting them and putting them in pipeline because you want a more diverse workforce, right? I don't think D&I is a short-term solution, right, to what inevitably will be a long-term journey, right? And I don't think it should be purely motivated by external pressures. Again, we're in very unprecedented times right now where people have to back up and ask themselves and their organizations what their why is. Like, why is it even important to you? Is it because of external pressure? Is there something internally you're trying to solve for, right? I want to say one more thing about D&I and what it is, however, and hopefully this will tie the loop on this, but I often say D&I isn't just practiced at the institutional level. It's practiced at the individual level by humans, right? Like it's practiced by humans. And so we can put a lot of policies and procedures around D&I, which helps, us really operationalize things. But at the end of the day, we need humans to start to think about D&I with each other, within meetings, one-on-one. And so I think what it's not is, it's not a short-term play. It's not this thing that you can wave a wand and answer very quickly to. And so I would caution people to, let's hire, for, XYZ people and push our diversity targets. Let's, just hire a head of diversity and that'll solve our problems. I think it's important to back up before you take action and just listen, right? Because people mistake listening for inaction, right? You want to kind of measure twice and cut once, right? That is part of the solution. Listening, taking a step back and challenging a team on why these things are important to you before wanting to go out and do and operationalize.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So when you are working with your clients, and these tend to be kind of the starting to grow startups, right? They don't have an in-house fully baked recruiting process, or probably even an HR or recruiting team, but they know they're starting to get pressure. They might have gotten a cash injection, Series A, B, or C. Like how do you step back with them? How do you get them to start at the beginning and then with the why rather than the what? Like, how do you guide hiring managers or executives in this early stage of this process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always say that, Allison, you can't outsource culture, right? Like you can outsource communication, you can get on Slack, you can get, contract folks to work on certain parts of your product. uh, you know, Diversity, equity, inclusion, and creating that and stitching it into your environment, it starts from your team. And the way I talk to clients about this is I set expectations, right? I say you can aim to hire, diverse talent the way you see it over the next few months, or for this tech hire that you're making, or for this executive hire you're making. Or you can hold yourself to a longer term journey that is actually a bit more challenging and say, I can make these next 2, 3 hires a bit more diverse. Or I can say, I want to see my organization to be, become 20 or 30% more diverse over the next 2 to 5 years. Right. And I want to keep myself accountable quarter by quarter, month by month, year by year to this long-term goal. And that way I can check myself and against it. Right. So I would say it goes back to the short-term solution. You can make a few hires that you can feel good about, and skip over, and in that practice, unfortunately, even exclude the rest of the thoughts and opinions of your actual organization. Right. So I challenge executives to think about what's your why, make a long-term solution, and then start to include your team, start to include your direct reports, start to include the broader organization, get their input and thoughts and opinions, and make it a long-term goal. And because it's so hard, in some cases, almost skips around the point of what you're trying to do with DE&I, right? Again, it's not this like thing that just happens. It's something that you're trying to strive for, and cement into your organization, and hopefully that becomes the new norm or normal for your organization. That example in any case, think about the word diverse, right? Like in and of itself, if I think of a black and brown or a woman or LGBTQ candidate as a diverse candidate, right? That almost like implies that folks who are heterosexual or not cisgender, like normal, right? Which shouldn't be the case. If you're defining a certain subset of people as diverse, that feeds into the problem that now this other group is considered normal, right? They're the standard, right? Diverse is almost a nomenclature, if you think about it, that defines people as less than, right? That's why individuals aren't diverse. That's why teams and communities are, right? I would almost argue contextually, if you're like hiring for a role, that if you want to create more diversity in your organization, yes, you should start to consider folks of different kinds of backgrounds. But that also transcends and includes, but transcends just what's on the surface, right? Profiles are diverse. If I had to hire, a head of recruiting that grew up as a programmer, that's pretty diverse as well, right? But I'm not going to consider a single, woman or black or brown candidate a diverse candidate. These are, if you want to, kind of cover what's there, these are underrepresented groups that have historically been marginalized, right? Let's be very direct with the language you want to say. But I think calling individuals diverse, and I'll close the loop here to your question, because I think this is important. It exacerbates that in what DNI is not. But back to kind of close the loop on how I work with executives, I try to set these kinds of expectations. That when someone comes to me and says, I want a diverse candidate, before I start, I have to set that expectation and what I just talked about and saying, well, let's define what you understand diversity to be first. I give them this. I talk them through DNI. I talk them through these principles that I'm, communicating now. And then that sets an expectations for them to say, oh, okay, now I understand how to think about it. And it resets their expectations.
Yes. And it almost is also like, well, you also have to kind of, when in these conversations, or as we're thinking about it within our own organizations, is like, let's just kind of level set. Where are we now? Who do we have on our
Right.
team? What is the composition of our team? Because, you know, if it's a little bit of a mix already, then the diversity is actually what are we missing in terms of product experience, industry experience,
Yep.
socioeconomic backgrounds, what are our customers looking
Absolutely.
like? How are we matching the people who are building the team, the products with the people that are being served by the products, right? So, you know, thinking through
Absolutely.
too, like we have to figure out where we are now and then what are we missing? And then what we're missing should be the intentional hiring, sourcing, recruiting, because that is what's going to bring the diversity in the team. It isn't by default
Absolutely.
anyone that's not X, Y, or Z. And because that's how you
Absolutely.
measure is that's start where we are at, but then what does diversity mean actually in this moment for our team right now?
Absolutely. And quite frankly, Allison, that's something, you can tie into employee experience and engagement, right? When you think about organizations like Culture Amp, who do a really good job at surveying and researching, I would say employee attitudes. That's part of it. It's about, let me ask my team. Do you feel there is a level of psychological safety in the environment? And mind you, these are all opt-in. This is all opt-in data, and so there's something to say if folks don't fill that out at all, right? That is to a certain degree the level of psychological safety that may be represented in your organization as well. And so I treat it as a data collection process. Start to collect data from your team, put these surveys together, iterate on them, and most importantly, act on the data, right? If you find a way to quantify it, if, and I'm using very obscure terms, but if psychological safety comes back 3 out of 5, your goal should, how do we get it to 4 out of 5 by the end of 2021, right? These are not esoteric things that that come from the start. These are things that are very measurable to a certain degree, but it is really about setting expectations, being realistic, and looking at these initiatives as long-term plays. These aren't some things that you want to satisfy because some degree of political correctness. These are things you want to satisfy because you truly believe, and this is part of my why, right? That they do create a much more innovative and focused and impressive and productive organization. And there's research out there. But that's your why, and you have to get to your why on your own.
Yes, and you're bringing back to the sort of the business case, which if people don't understand the business case by now, it's for having a diverse team that comes from different experiences and
Hmm.
backgrounds. Like I love the quote that homogenous thinking is dangerous in complex environments, and it is teams
Absolutely.
that are homogenous that deliver products that are subpar or even in some cases deadly. So when
Absolutely.
airbags first came out in cars, they disproportionately killed women and children because the product
Right.
teams were all men and all of the dummies in the testing were all male sized bodies, and women have narrow shoulders, they have wider hips,
Yep.
and they were being killed
Exactly.
by these products because they were not represented. And even then, the team just shrunk the male dummy bodies and didn't modify the proportions. And it's like, also on the other side of that, you have a company like Apple, the most innovative company in the world, who
Hmm.
launched their health app to much fanfare, only to
Yeah.
realize when the market cried out that there was no option for menstruation tracking, something that affects
Yeah.
50% of the global population on a monthly
Population.
basis for decades of their life. And their team just didn't even think about it. You could track your selenium in your blood, but you couldn't track your period. And so that
Right.
cost Apple millions of dollars to go back and add
Absolutely.
in this feature in a product that no one on their team was like, hey, should we think about this? You know?
Adding this thing in it, that's a great example, and that's exactly what I was alluding to, Allison. Like when you think about the business case, it's there. It's you know uh, innovation accounts for twice the revenue against your peers, right? When you think about the companies that last long periods of time, that evolve over time, right? The one thing I also want to say with an asterisk or cautioning is, I think the broader conversation around DE&I has been extremely productive. I think there are certain pockets of the broader conversation that may unfortunately create a them versus us landscape. And I want to emphasize that I think for the people who are focused on creating a much more diverse, equitable, inclusive environment at their organizations, whether you're in the C-suite, whether you're a founder, whether you're an employee, I think the pathway to doing that is here. And I think it should be applauded in of itself. And I want to recognize that these are very, very hard conversations. They're not easy. And, you know, even just starting to have the conversations is part of the battle. But what I do want to say is that it's also, we have to recognize that the long-term winners in when you look at history are the folks who invest in social innovation, right? Like technological innovation will keep you ahead for maybe 5, maybe even 10 years, but your competition catches up. Social innovation, to your point, Allison, is when you're able to create and produce products that on paper capture a much more wide segment of the market, and maybe even addressable markets that weren't even considered before, right? And we can look at this across several industries over the last 100 years, opening their doors to more and more and more diverse populations. We've seen it in entertainment, we've seen it in technology, you know. And so I think it's really important to understand that it's not just about, you know, creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization, because it is the right thing to do. But you see multiples of efficiencies. You do come out as a market leader in that vein. Social innovation will last you 100 years and more. Technological innovation is a short-term play that won't keep you ahead for too long. If anyone's familiar with Michael Porter's 5 forces, right? I think the 6th force that's missing, and arguably the most important, is people, right? He talks about customers, he talks about suppliers, buyers, new market entrants. But from a business perspective, your people, your employees, is probably the most recognizable and most influential force, right? And they can be all those things. That's the beautiful part. Your employees can be your customers, and often should. They can be your buyers, and often should. You have an opportunity to create really, really amazing mechanics, right, within your organization. And the thing that you can control are the people who are creating the product and driving value. And once you do that, people can't copy that, right? People can copy, they can you know, create, they can drive prices down. If you have a low barrier entry market, they can, you know, you'll see tons of new entrants. They can manage relationships with suppliers. But one thing people can't do is copy culture. They can't copy your people. And if you invest back in that, I promise you that the outcome will be tremendous.
And in terms of like thinking about us on the recruiting space, this is something that I think we don't often talk enough about. And this is the drum that we're banging over at Recruiting Innovation and through the trainings that we develop and our talent grant that we have, that, you know, as recruiters, we are the builders of teams. We are the drivers of who is sourced, who is interviewed, who is hired, who is retained. And I think that it's time for us. I'm encouraged looking in the market, seeing chief talent officers and seeing talent as a, you know, kind of separating from HR and getting its own, like, you know, support and recognition for the value. And it's something that I think as an industry, we need to kind of, I don't want to say, you know, eat our own dog food, but we need to recognize that we have a responsibility. It's not, we shouldn't be waiting for our executives to ask us to be intentional. We as individuals need to realize it's on us to be these drivers, whether someone asks us to or not. So what have you found to be successful when either within Beacon or when, you know, working with the clients that you work with? What's making for successful like sourcing practices? What are some things that we can actually do as recruiters to drive, you know, bringing the right mix of folks to be even considered into our organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's probably the part where a lot of people are standing on their toes and kind of waiting for, right? I want to take a quick moment to also emphasize the expectation setting, right?
Mhm.
Because as you know, we probably have a mix of folks here, but to your point, Allison, when you're having to deal and navigate different personalities and executives and make the business case, all your efforts downstream may be roadblocked. And so I do want to take a second to also emphasize what we just talked about around laying the foundation and setting expectation, because that's half of the work. I also want to say, once you continue to do that on the sourcing and recruiting and tactical front, what you can do tactically is, one, go where those communities are, right? It goes back to the fact that you can, post and pray on job boards, and you may have a quick turnaround, that's fine. But if you are aligned with your team, or while you're getting aligned with your team and setting long-term expectations for D&I, that'll give you the runway to say, okay, I have 12 months now and not 3 to create a much more diverse community or workforce. I'm going to start, I don't know, very obscure. I'm going to have one event a month, and I'm going to start, partnering with organizations that have relationships and engage with diverse communities, right? I'm going to start engaging them more thoughtfully. I'm going to start understanding what is my being our organization's value add to these communities, right? Is it exposure? Is it better understanding? Is it accessibility? So I'd say, start to go to where those communities live, start to engage them thoughtfully over a long period of time. And from there, you'll start to see, a return, so to speak, because those communities will invest back in you through opportunities, through employment, right, and candidacies, through, buying power and purchasing power, right? And so I'd say the first thing you need to do is go where those communities live and build those relationships. That's part of the strategy. When it comes to sourcing and screening, especially at Beacon, we practice what's called outcomes-based hiring. And I want to preface this with you won't learn everything there is to do on this call, right? I don't think anyone can truncate.
Cannot eat an elephant.
That and right, you can't. And so I'll be following up with some collateral for everyone here, post event, things that you can take away on paper. But we use what's called a scorecard in short at Beacon. And a scorecard is different from a job description. A job description, I say, often unfortunately starts with biases. It starts with, we need someone who has had VC-backed experience, who's graduated from a top-tier school, right? And that's where a lot of these biases live. We don't start with that language. We start with a scorecard that denotes, these are the organizational priorities. This is how those organizational priorities are distilled into departmental or team priorities. And that's how those departmental or team priorities are distilled into individual outcomes for that candidate or role, excuse me. And we do it on a 30, 60, or however smart, framework, whatever framework we want to use. We make it objective as possible and consistent as possible. And we use that scorecard as the bar for measuring the candidate. We always say you don't want to compare candidates to each other. You want to benchmark them against the scorecard. And that's how we keep our process consistent and at least as objective as possible. And it's an iterative process, because again, it goes back to, making sure you're navigating, your environment and then seeing where you're starting. Because, for example, if your hiring managers or interviewers are not even submitting feedback post-interview, it's going to be hard to hold them accountable to the scorecard, right? So I think it goes back to that. Again, I want to really, really drive this point home about half the work is setting expectations. Half the work is setting the foundation, because you can't do this good work unless you're in the environment to do so. And we could talk about that more in a moment. But tactically, it's go where they are, build community where they are, use a scorecard, and be as objective in your feedback as possible, and try to hold people accountable to that feedback. And that is a very iterative process.
So let's talk about the scorecard, because I've used scorecards as like an interview feedback tool to also make sure that interviewers are asking different questions and that we're being strategic about the team interview aspect. But in your case, you're saying the scorecard is first before a job description. It's more like, okay, we're going to need we need help. We need someone to do some front end development. So they need to be able to have maybe had experience creating a chat box for a website. They need to have like improved speed time. So you're talking about like, what are the outcomes? What do they need to deliver? And then do you talk about, well, what kind of profile would do that? Or is it more like, then that's your job description and it's all outcome? I'm just trying to
Yeah, great question. Great. So we're not so rigid in that there's no flexibility in it, right? I think it depends on the environment. And when, especially when you think of, and what I've experienced with first of roles, right? Your first head of marketing, or your first head of operations, your first GM, because you broke in geography, right? You don't know what you don't know. And the idea of the scorecard is to get as close to a roadmap as possible. And from creating that scorecard, you start to translate those scorecard requirements into what we consider traits. And your traits, or competencies, if you will, come into two sets. They come as skills and behaviors. It's almost like inputs and outputs, right? Your technical skills is what they need to deliver on those outcomes. And the behavioral traits make up the persona of the person that they'll likely have those technical traits. And the great thing about the scorecard is job descriptions are so definitive, right? And we often, and hopefully a lot of us on the call and beyond, are starting to realize that, going back to, groups and communities that are, have been historically marginalized, may not have had the opportunity, right, that other folks have, right? So it's about now making trade-offs, right? So if you need on your scorecard, this skill, this skill, and this skill, you have to understand the trade-offs. Well, if I need someone to do this, and they don't have this, it may take them longer to do that. Okay, let me go back to the scorecard. Can I get that person to get that done in 60 days? Now, if they don't have that skill and it takes 90 days, will we be okay? I think we think too definitively about what the ideal candidate is, right? I think we're still in a recruiting environment where we're chasing purple squirrels, right? I think we need to back up and say, realistically speaking, the ideal candidate doesn't live in a vacuum, right? There are trade-offs to make between time and expertise. If we need someone tomorrow, sure, maybe those 4 skills are need to haves, because we need to get that person ramped up to do XYZ in 30 days, or we're out of funding. We're on a bridge loan right now, and we're done if we don't get those things done. But if you say, you know what, these 2 things should be done in the first 60 days, if I want to create a much more diverse environment, I can wait 120 days to skill this person up on this 4th piece. This 4th piece is not as pressing as I realize. And I'm willing now to make the trade-off of getting there quicker in order to hire a much more diverse community, or go out to a much more diverse pool of talent.
Yeah, and you're bringing
it's about trade-offs.
Totally. And it's also about like kind of as an industry, reflecting on the structures and systems that have been in place on how we recruit for decades. The system is working by design. When you look at least within the tech industry, 80% of tech workers are white, 74% are male, and the average age is 27 with the median 29. So predominantly white, male, and young. And then if you step back, it's like you see these job descriptions where it's like has 7 years experience. Well, that's convenient. If there's groups of people that never even got the chance to get 2, you're just naturally reinforcing, hey, you had access in the first place. And then you think back
Exactly.
about the benefits that you offer that feed that group, like thinking about the equity
Exactly.
stuff, like we as an organization, as an industry, need to sort of reflect on, wait, I think we could all just stop and say, hey, these things I've always been doing, is this in some way perpetuating bias to, you know, the
Absolutely.
Mark Zuckerberg looker people of tech, for
Yeah.
example. And so to step back and say, no, let's talk about outcomes and what's trainable versus what they need to walk in. Yeah, that's again playing the long game, knowing that it's not, you can't do everything and fast. So it's sort of like, let's slow down in order to speed up ultimately down the road.
Right. What trade-offs are we willing to make for the greater good? And if you had that why conversation, right, it'll click with you, right? And you know what? I know the reality. I've worked with for and partnered with VC-backed organizations that have mandates from gray-haired investors to move at 10x a year. I've been there. And I think it's truly about the expectation setting, depending on your organization, will ebb and flow. You may have greater pushback in one organization for another. Again, I've worked across a diversity of different organizations, and so I understand not everyone is the same, and so or not every organization, excuse me, is the same, and so also understand the environment that you're in and where you need to push harder, right, and where you don't, and so I'd say, and I know I'm harping on this point, but what will allow you to act on these things is setting the context, setting the foundation. If you have a hiring manager that like, I need to hire tomorrow, this is where, Allison, you made a great point in that we have a seat on at the table as talent practitioners. You need to ask why, right? We're not doormats anymore, and we need to take a much more consultative approach to hiring. So if a hiring manager comes to me with, I need to make this hire in 30 days, I ask why, and I ask, well, what is going to be impacted if we don't? Sometimes, and a lot of the time, you'll find that that's the culture we're in, right? I was listening to Indie Hackers yesterday, and a podcast episode with Basecamp founder, and he's from Denmark, and he just had a hilarious intro, a little bit tangential, around how he's like, I've never worked 80 hours a week ever in my life, right? And I came to America and found that there's a startup culture around people like, you need to get after it and crush it, right? And that just wasn't existent for me whatsoever. And I've created a very successful company over the long term because I didn't lax on my principles and values. And so I think you make a good point, Allison. You have to slow down and speed up sometimes. But from putting my recruiter hat on, you can't be afraid to partner with the business. You need to ask questions that show that you are a partner and not a contractor. If someone says, I need a role filled in 30 days, you don't say, all right, I'm gonna go get it done. You say, well, why? Because, I was just like chatting with our CEO and these are our goals for the year. And I don't see where this connects in the next 60 days. I don't see this getting impacted in 45 days if we don't make this hire tomorrow. You have to know the business. I think that's what I want to go back to and some of that is, depending on your organization, great relationships, but some of that is like, you have to take the initiative and be proactive, right? As a talent practitioner, do you understand the business model of your organization? Do you understand the pain points, right? Again, that's why I say at Beacon, we're moving more in the direction of a McKinsey versus, a traditional talent agency, because that model is dead. Right? We need to have skin in the game. We need to have a seat at the table because that's how you serve your hiring managers and stakeholders to the best of your ability. So that's where I want to close the loop. Actually, is be a partner to the business. Do your homework.
Yes, and that's when we go from being a note taker or order taker to being a business partner, consultative, and I think one of the key themes here is the long game and playing the long game and this is something I say as well, like when people are trying to be more intentional about building a bigger tent and then their recruiting process is, it's just like when you enter a new market and you're now suddenly going to be hiring a bunch of marketers, you're new there.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to know that you're going to start going to these events. You're going to start networking in the networking groups. It's going to take 60, 90 days to really build up a network in this new vertical or this new, swim lane.
Exactly.
The same should go with underrepresented talent for your organization. The pipelines are there. We just need to identify them and then build the bridge to them. And it takes a little time.
Right.
And it builds on itself, because also we know in recruiting, when you are exceptional at what you do, you provide good service, those candidates will tell their friends, and they're,
exactly.
It builds on itself, but it does take time and it takes intention. And that means that you have to turn around and then educate your team. Like your 30 days is short. We know that we have to deal with that, but maybe not this role, but you're already doing the things that the second role and the third role, and the way we build isn't just for a quick turnaround anymore, because that's not solving the business problem either.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Recruiting is a business problem, like in a nutshell. It's not just HR. We have a philosophy at Beacon where if you trace back, missed deadlines, poor product performance, poor CSAT or NPS scores from customer. Again, it goes back to the 6 fourths that, I'm going to pen an article about the 6 fourths and see what people say, but it's your people. That is right. They are your customer service representatives. They are your product people. They are your technologists, your project managers. And so if you really understand functionally how your organization operates, you'll have more perspective as a talent practitioner and say, organizationally, maybe we don't even need this role. A little bit tangential. I've been in those seats where maybe we should merge these 2 roles together, or maybe we don't need this hire now. We move this to Q4 and move this up Q2, right? And now we have more runway to do this, right? Be a partner to the business and understand how the business operates, so you'll have both the affinity and I would say the respect, quite frankly, to command those kinds of decision making. But I can go on forever. I'll let Alison.
Yes, and I want to also invite everyone in the call, if you have any questions or you want to bring a point up, or you want us to talk about something a little bit more in detail, feel free to pop into chat. I know we had a little bit of technical issues earlier with people with the link, so I apologize for that. So I know some of you folks joined us late. We are recording all of this and we'll send it out to everyone afterwards. But please, we want to hear from you as well. So feel free to pop in chat if you have any questions. We're going to go about 10 more minutes. We can go a little bit over because I know we started a little late from technical issues. But one more question, Anthony, and then we can open it up to the questions from the chat. Like, what's at stake? What if we don't do anything different? What if we just keep doing everything the way we've always been doing it in recruiting? What are your concerns? What do you see on the forefront if we don't start doing things differently?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. So I'm not a fortune teller, but what I can say is that I think I look at it as Moore's law, right, of computing. Things will get worse exponentially quicker, right? And I think that the point you made about homogenous teams is very valid, in that we're hiring earlier, we're hiring quicker, we're moving quicker. We're in the era of the smart candidate, right? How we've been in the era of the smart consumer, and consumers have information at their fingertips now. They have access to data. We are in the smart candidate era, where candidates understand how recruiting works a bit more. Candidates have different expectations that they had 10 years ago. They have different opportunities that they had 10 years ago. And I think that what's at stake, I guess there's what's at stake broadly speaking, but I guess everyone here is more relevant. What's at stake for an individual organization is that diversity is not what you need to simply get ahead anymore. It's what you need to survive, right? Survival is at stake, not innovation anymore. We talked a lot about innovation, but quite frankly, it's survival. Because kind of the saying, I think 97.8% of startups or new businesses fail. Um, Organizations are hiring more quickly and aggressively. If you're not moving as quickly as these organizations who are diversifying their workforce and being intentional and inclusive and equitable in their practices, you're going to lose out to talent and opportunity very quickly as an executive, as a founder, entrepreneur, a business leader. And the world is very flat. That's going to travel, right? Just literally on paper, brand matters, right? I think it's, 46% of the tween generation. I don't know if that's like, bad verbiage or whatever. But 46% of them won't even think about applying for a job if they don't have any kind of environmental impact or mission, driven ideology or anything of that matter around preserving the planet. That's 46%, right? And so when you think about it, what's at stake is survival for your business, for your product, for your company. And so I think it's, when you think about it, it's really about, how do I stay ahead of the curve? And it goes back to the point we made earlier. It's about social innovation. How do I continue to innovate my workforce internally as a sixth force to make sure that the many kinds of people and backgrounds of the world are seen and heard in my organization? And that way I can capture more market, serve more people, address more individuals, identify more personas, create more products, more product segments. I think it's survival. That's what's at stake. And I'll say this again: if you want to last 5 years, invest in technological innovation. If you want to last 100 years, invest in social innovation.
Amen. I agree 100% with that. And it's not rocket surgery, but it is enough that it's a bit of a paradigm shift. And what we've done before isn't going to be what is going to get us where we need to go moving forward. We have a question here coming in relating to, talking about inclusive recruitment and scorecards. How does you think that could translate into things related to more on the academic side? So selective admissions, day schools, universities, fellowship programs. What is something that we can do to kind of encourage more inclusiveness or more diversity, or maybe even in the evaluation process? How do we do that within the academic side of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And while I'm not privy specific to academia and university, I'm sure there's a host of different biases and exclusionary practices that this, I want to say you're more familiar, Christian, than myself, right? But I guess, I, off the top of my head, I think about, boosters that, get, or sponsors that get kids in schools ahead of peers. I think of, that whole, I forget her name, the whole college scandal with that actress who, so I'm less privy to this specific, but what I can say is the mechanics don't change. One thing I'll say about bias is a very dirty word right now for a reason. Bias, though, or unconscious bias is a mechanism that the brain uses as a shortcut to make a decision, right? That is the operational definition of bias. Just like we have operational definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion. So I wouldn't say bias is inherently bad, right? What is bad is allowing our biases to go unchecked. And the first thing I would encourage you to do, whether it's specific to this environment or not, is brush up on, what biases exist. And there are a few of them, right? There is latency bias. There's cheerleader effect, right? There's there are literally hundreds of different kinds of biases. So I'd brush up on that. Then what I would start to do is start to identify those biases in that working environment and start to make the case for, well, these biases exist here, and this is how it's ultimately impacting our ability to be productive, to be innovative, and whatever that value add is for your environment, whether it's higher enrollment or more engaged students or a much more diverse faculty, whatever the value add or the carrot, and I hate to use that term, but it's a very plain English, whatever that carrot is, tie that back to creating much more inclusionary and diverse practices. And start to drive that, in that manner. So I hope that answers your question. I don't, and depending on what the role is, you can create a scorecard for just about anything. Again, it ebbs and flows, right? If it's for a professor, I don't know what, or faculty member, I don't know exactly what those outcomes will look like. But scorecarding is, I would say, it's the practice in of itself is important, and less the form, right? I have templates I can provide and share. Make them your own, right? That's what I would encourage you to do.
Yeah, and then to piggyback off that in terms of the scorecard for during the review stage, so not necessarily during the sort of who are we looking for, but now you're talking to people, I also recommend, you have your scorecards where it's like a 1 to 5, how do they scale, how do they score
Right.
on communication, what have you, technical abilities, whatever. You can have a line in that scorecard, at least on the hiring process, to say, does this person have a experience or a skill set that is new or different for our team? So that's an inherent way to say, yes, actually, they come from a different background. They have a different demographic than what we have. Like, they get extra points because literally they come from a different skill set, a different background, a different demographic. And people, if you are wanting to be intentional, when you have, two very similar candidates, the candidate that is different or adds a different value because it's not replicated already 7 times on your team, they should get more points because they are adding a different perspective. So that's also something you can do within your, the evaluation. Will this person be adding value, or is this the same person that we've hired 7 times already?
Exactly. You make a great point in that, Allison. All competencies aren't equal. Allison is essentially saying there are certain traits on that scorecard that weigh over others, right? That you'll want to index towards. And again, to that point, if you have 4 traits, the level of importance for one trait might, to Allison's point, in terms of diversity, should and can be twice as important or weighed twice against any other trait that you may have. And so again, it's really about trade-offs versus expectations, right? If I want to, see these kinds of profiles, I'm going to have to index toward them and make it apparent and set the expectation with my team and say, hey, when we get together, one thing we do is debrief on our candidates. And so after the interview, we'll get on a quick 10, 15-minute Zoom call and contextualize our feedback that we submitted. And that's where we can catch and identify some biases and say, whoa, we're not sticking to the scorecard. We talked about this, but we're heading here. And so I think it's really important to contextualize the feedback as well and understand where can you leverage the scorecard to index towards more, a diversity of profiles. Great. That's a great point, Alison.
Yeah. And last question, before we wrap up, this is a really great question as well, related to when we are working with our hiring manager or, the interview team, or maybe even the executive, and we're starting to pick up on resistance from them. Maybe they're holding to, I want an Ivy League grad, I want, an internal referral, I want a culture fit, or the very famous and very clear tell, like, we value diversity, but we want to hire the best, right? Like, we all know the coded language of, I'm uncomfortable with things being different, and so I'm going to hold to what I've always done. What can we do as recruiters, or when we're trying to now be a consultant and not an order taker? What are some things? What's a piece of advice that you might have to help this recruiter or this talent person feel empowered to say, think about it this way, or here's an example. Have you found some ways that help people sort of shift their perspective to being more open and collaborative in that direction?
Absolutely. It's a great question, and it's a tough one. And it's definitely something that I think it's very much a case by case basis, and it's something that you have to kind of work on with different. It's a muscle, right? And it's a muscle I've even had to over time, and still am, depending on the organization, the persons, and the environment, have to work on. And so I want to preface it with like, a one conversation may not do it, 1 month may not do it. It's not a checkbox. What I can say though is it goes back to actually your point, Allison, around if on paper we can show how some of these different traits and skill sets help them achieve what they're looking for, i.e. the outcomes, then we're better off indexing towards certain kind of profiles. For example, it is very well known that, for example, I was working on a role, I'll be anecdotal, and I remember there was this like very typical profile that the hiring manager looked for, and it was really, really tough to engage that person because they were like, you know folks were going after these kinds of profiles every day, and so the competition was there. They usually demanded more in the industry. And so I sat down with the hiring manager and said, hey, like, let's look at your organization. Let's create a scorecard for this role. And I know you've traditionally hired for this role with this profile. I did a market mapping, right? And I saw 3 different personas that maybe don't look like what you've hired before, but they can do these. I think I'll give you as close as enough silhouette. I think it was some overlap between customer service. I'll just say that, where a lot of people could have done the role. And I said, listen, like, I've identified this persona of people who I think could do the job. They'll take about probably 30 more days to ramp up because they don't have this, but they're 20% less. They cost 20% less than your target market. And they have this skill set as well. They have a much more diverse skill set. So they'd be able to provide this perspective to your team. Over time, you're not only you're running into a cost savings, right? You're also getting a new perspective because I know you're building this product thing. Very little context for everyone here, but this is the product you're building. This is the skill set this new persona provides that your traditional one doesn't. So not only are you saving $250,000 this year because these people, from a median average, salary perspective, demand more. They have a different perspective to offer, which will then improve the product you're building, which will then net into more retention. And he said, wow, I've never seen anyone approach recruiting that way, because at the end of the day, we need to stop treating it like a hammer and nail situation, right? It goes back to the point I made earlier, is know your business. Know your business, know your business model, and start to translate some components to that of the talent, or to the market. So I'd say is, if you know exactly what the role does and you understand what the outcomes are, you can start to experiment with different personas, right? I remember I was reading, what was it called? Work Rules, right? By the old chief people officer of Google. And his HR organization was made of a bunch of ex-management consultants, which is not the norm, traditionally, but that is a diversity of profiles. He mentioned brought a different perspective to his people organization. These people were very analytical. They were very evidence-based. He started bringing in data scientists. He was the first person to do that, Laszlo Block, sorry. So I think it's about, again, diversity, is about, yes, it includes ethno, demographic, and sexual orientation. It also includes shape, size, thinking, socioeconomic, in cultural upbringing. And if you can identify personas that will help align your organization to their outcomes, just come to the table with those personas and make the case. But it takes you getting an understanding of the business, and truly acting as a partner first.
Yes. Yeah. And it's about, yeah, not just receiving what is given to us, but then to also give back and think through things ahead of time and a little bit more preparation. Yeah. And it's a new muscle too, everyone, as we start to
Yeah,
do new things, that's
it
what,
is.
power equals work over time. And so the more we try something new, we get better at it, but knowing full stop, when something is new, it's going to be uncomfortable, but discomfort is a prerequisite for growth. And so it's actually good to feel
Absolutely.
uncomfortable. It's a good sign that you are pushing some boundaries, you're doing something new. But if you do it
Absolutely.
consistently enough, you start to build a muscle, and then you start to get stronger, and then that becomes the natural way of doing it. And so it's just
Absolutely.
be tenacious. And we really are in a unique place, y'all, and as recruiters, to really drive this for our industry. And part of that is just having webinars like these, learning, reading. There's a lot of resources out there about just even understanding. I know from my place of privilege as a white person, as a white woman, like, it's been eye-opening the last few years as I've really been dedicated to just sort of unlearning and learning that there's a whole different world out there that operates in a different way. And the more that I can understand that and have empathy and perspective, the more I see value in different ways that I wouldn't have even noticed before. And so being
Absolutely.
able to bring that to my organization, or even just my own self, like having my own
Right.
goals. And there's even just some data out there, and we can add this to our follow-up, because
Yeah.
small things such as when you put forward a group of candidates, if you have at least 2 women in there, in the group of initial candidates that you consider, if there's at least 2 women there in the candidate pool, 70% chance that one of the women will be hired. However, if you only have 1 woman in your candidate pool, there is statistically 0 chance she will be hired, because of the way that we are,
Wow.
you want to replicate who you have. And it's, so
No.
there's like small things that okay, I'm not going to put forward candidates until I have at least 2 2 people of non-white background demographics.
Yeah.
Then it's 80% chance that one of them will be hired when there's 2, but when there's 1, 0%. So there's also just the mechanics.
I didn't even know that. Yeah. That's
Yeah, it's a
amazing. That's a
Harvard
great.
business,
Yeah.
it's either Harvard Business Review or Microsoft discovered. They call it a
Yeah.
2 in the pool. As long as you have 2
Two.
underrepresented people in your candidate pool initially, that it's incrementally bigger chance that one
There's
of
a
them will get hired.
statistical
Yeah.
significance. Yeah.
So,
Awesome. Well,
well, thanks so much for joining me
awesome.
on this conversation, Anthony. I do
No,
this every month.
thank you.
I feel like we should just
Yeah.
even do a full training on what is a scorecard. Let's talk about the outcomes-based hiring a little
Absolutely.
bit more. I mean, because it's the whole
I
process.
mean,
It's a whole workflow.
exactly. It's much more holistic than, I think what we talked about today. I'd say this is a nice little primer.
Yes.
I think there's so much, to Allison's point, to learn. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I'm still molding my perspective as I continue on my journey as a talent practitioner. And you got to have the conversations, and you got to listen, right?
Yep.
And again, listening is so important. I hope that the things we talked about today, you can go and do, and you can go and apply, but you had to come and listen today first, right?
Right.
So really continue to focus on opening your ears and learning and growing, to Allison's point. And that's where a lot of the learning comes from. I'm not gonna lie, some of it is best practices, some of it is contextual, some of it is specific to your organization, your person, the people you deal with, right? And so keep pushing, keep growing, keep partnering with the business, and keep challenging yourself. And we'll follow up with some interesting material. But Alison, thank you so much for having me today. Everyone, thank you for joining and doing the work. We are a community. We're all dedicated towards the same mission, I want to say. And I'm just excited to invest back into this community.
Yes.
Right, I'm going where the community lives.
Exactly. 100%. It's about playing the long game and being patient with ourselves and our organizations, but also holding ourselves to what our intentions are. So Thanks again for your time, everyone. We will follow up with a very thorough follow-up email, including the video recording. So I know we had some issues there, but we will continue the conversation. So stay tuned, and yeah, may the force be with y'all. Thanks,
Allison.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.